This is the Amazing Education Podcast. Powered by the Ames Community School District, I'm your host, Eric Smith. On today's episode, we are joined by longtime history and government teacher Kristin Sullivan from Ames High School. We're going to have an amazing conversation about the importance of engaging high school students in the election process and how to be an informed voter. All right, Kristin Sullivan, thanks for being on this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So I don't know if you knew this, but we have an election coming up.
Yeah, I heard a little. Something.
I don't know how a person could miss it at this point, but I thought it would be a really timely conversation for us to have around school and education and the election and how those two things really intermix. And the first person I thought of was you to have that conversation with. So I'm really excited that you're able to come on. So when we think about like high school, it always feels like, middle school and high school students, they're really getting to that age where they want to be more involved and they start to pay a lot more attention to not just politics, but issues that are important to them. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that. Why do you think that is? I mean, you've been around high schoolers much of your career.
My whole career.
Yeah.
Ames High, actually, my whole career.
Oh, I love it.
There's a curiosity, in young people that's just kind of natural, and some of that curiosity flocks to, where they'll end up in their profession, the sciences or music or art or history or literature. But I think as kids get into high school, later high school, especially in Iowa, politics becomes a bigger deal. They start to see the relevance. We're really lucky where we live because the candidates during the primary season, they all come here, and there's not a lot of places you could go to a diner downtown and meet Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton. In fact, a lot of my students tell me that when they go off to college, if they go out of state, their roommates and friends are always astonished, like, you met all the candidates? And but our students think that's normal because of where they live. And so I think that helps living in Iowa because we're the first in the nation caucus, that gives us, a nice leg up as far as getting to meet the candidates. Also, I think living in Ames, a college town, there's more involvement and a little more curiosity about it. But they're just eager. Kids are sponges, and if you're enthusiastic about something, and they're gonna lean in a little and want to hear more. And not every kid, but a whole lot of them are really interested.
So I was reading something the other day, and it talked about the correlation between having like a civics education or having a teacher who is enthusiastic about, not just politics, but the process in and of itself, and how that can really correlate to student engagement. And you even noted it's like, it's not for every student, but I'm sure that you have a number of success stories that, you've gotten students more involved in this process than what maybe you even anticipated.
Well, I think so. Rachel Junk's probably a good example. Rachel was in my AP Gov class, and I had not had Rachel in class before, and she was really interested and excited. But she hadn't really talked about, I think I'd like to do this as a young college student. And then she reached out to me when she decided to run for city council, and what do you think? And I said, I think that sounds great. And she said, well, I'm an Iowa State student. I said, it doesn't matter. You still have a voice. You still have a population that needs to be represented. And so she went for it. So I think, and there's a lot of kids who, really anybody, if you see the relevance, it's so much. I was just talking to my students this last week about why people show up to vote, why they don't vote, and why they have what we call low political efficacy, or believing that it matters. And I think a lot of it is just lack of information, that they don't see the relevance, they don't see why it matters. And I tell my students, I said, it's math. I said, decisions are made by the people who show up. And so if you want someone else to make a decision for you, then don't show up. But somebody's going to show up and a decision's going to be made. Yeah. And they seem to take to that. And, I also tell them, don't give away your power. This is your power. And they're all about their power. So, so I think those two things. But we talk, there's the, kind of the boring stuff that you just need to understand about the way your government operates. But I think when they see how we originated and how different we are, and that we're not built around, a common language or a common religion or a common, we're built around pluralism, more than one idea. And even when that's hard, it's still what makes us us. And I think they're fascinated by that. So if I can get them excited, I tell them, yes, I'm going to give you your requirements for graduation, and yes, I'm going to prepare you for the AP exam, but really I just care that you vote. I care that you show up and advocate for yourself. And I think they get that. Yeah. So they're usually pretty excited. We have a Young Democrats group at the high school, a Young Americans for Freedom group, which is not Republican, but it's more conservative. There are Republican kids in it, libertarian kids are in it, and they've gotten more and more active. So I think it sort of feeds. You get a group that's excited, and it feeds into another group. It seems like my whole career at Ames High, we've always had some sort of political discussion group that met or club, and I think that keeps it going. Plus, we have groups like SACRE. So SACRE centers around civil rights, but they talk a lot about policy, and they talk a lot about institutional or systemic racism that can be addressed if you have people in office who will address it. So I think there's just sort of a natural marriage between, what I do kind of officially in the classroom, along with Mrs. Stearns, who also teaches U.S. government, and the other clubs that exist. So, but you're right, enthusiasm, I think, is the key. If you've got to think it matters, or you're not going to bother.
One of the things that I've always appreciated about some of the stuff that you do, and you reference some of the student groups, is the voter drive and getting students out to vote. But, you're there and a part of it. But from my perspective and my interactions have always been like the students are leading this. You're just kind of there to, maybe steer it a little bit. But the students are really doing this, and they do it in a bipartisan way.
And it's really important to them. I unlock the door. Like I tell them, I have the key. That's it. They are, and I guide them a little. We need to remember about making announcements and when the deadlines are. But they have kids sign up to work the tables. And obviously, we're not doing that this fall because of COVID. But and they do it, and they make a sign-up sheet, and they do it. They tend to come to me if they have questions, or if they need to get in the building at a weird time to hang up their posters, things like that.
Sure.
But I'm clerical. My role, because they're motivated. And I'll tell you an interesting story. This fall, so we've not been in the building as a whole school. And the new leaders of the Young Democrats said, we want to still have the drive, but the faculty advisor of the Young Americans for Freedom was Dan Flannery, who passed away, of course, just before school started.
Sure.
And so their group was kind of, working to find new leadership. And I knew the leaders because I have them in class. I had one of them in class last year, and I have her again this semester. And so reached out, and they said, they're working on getting a sponsor, which they have a new one now. Chris Kronovich is their sponsor. But the Dems, they wanted to do the drive, but they said, we still really want to do it in a bipartisan way, but we don't want to make the YAF group feel like they've got to jump in and do all this because they don't even have a sponsor. And they're, grieving the loss of their other sponsor. So I love that they said, well, it's bipartisan no matter what. We'll do the legwork. And so they did some things, and they reached out to Sarah and Sophia and talked, about a few things. And the messaging was just really important, which I liked. So we did it virtually, and in my classroom, I still had hard copies of registration forms and absentee ballots. People wanted them, and I think a few people stopped to get them. But the kids put together a document that had links to all sorts of things. Here's where you register. Here's how you get an absentee ballot. Here's the schedule for early voting. And then they had some links to websites. Here's the GOP website. Here's the Democratic website. I think they included Libertarian and Green parties also.
Sure.
But they just did a really good job of trying to get kids informed. Now, we don't have any way of knowing. Normally, we would have anywhere between, probably about 80, 85 students would register in a fall drive and then again in a spring drive. We don't have any way of knowing virtually. We put in a Google form, but I know already that more registered than than answered the question in the form.
Yeah, sure.
We all want one more form to fill out. So we don't really have any way of knowing about turnout this year, but it's usually pretty good. I would say it kind of depends. You can register at 17, and so the kids will, kind of target the juniors and the seniors and try to get them registered. But there's usually more enthusiasm if there's an election. So if there's a caucus or something like that coming.
Yep.
And I think there would be enthusiasm if we were able to do it live. And I think there is, but we just don't know because we're not there to see it. But the kids who are organizing it, I sent it to the person who needed to email it out, and that's what I did. They did it all. They were marvelous.
So because they're so engaged, and we're talking, primarily let's talk, juniors and seniors, they're on the cusp of being able to vote. What are the big topics for our students right now that they're really, rallying behind?
Well, several. I think they worry a lot about the Affordable Care Act. That comes up when you hear, they'll hear talk on both sides about losing coverage for pre-existing conditions, or I can't stay on my parents' insurance, and we're in a recession. What if I don't get a job? So I think that one feels tangible, especially kids who have chronic illnesses. That one's very tangible to them. I think taxes. I think they pay attention to taxes. A lot of them
In what sense?
Well, a lot of them have jobs where they get a paycheck.
Okay.
And so when we talk about taxes and what, that their taxes are this big umbrella, but there's a lot of different kinds.
Yeah.
And, so they know the SSI tax. That's the biggie that comes out. And, what's that for? And, explain it. So I think they pay a little closer attention because they're affected. They know that this was my gross and this is my net, and here's why. And, some kids are like, well, this is, the price of doing business. And then other kids are like, well, I wish it wasn't that high. So you have both. You have both, which is interesting, and it makes for good conversation. I think I actually hear, and it's interesting because I probably heard from more young men than women out in conversations, but really from both, they're really watching the Supreme Court. They're interested in with the new court, and they know that we've talked a little bit about the judiciary already in class, and they understand the basic process, and will the Roe v. Wade be overturned? And I think as young people, they're looking at, being in there, going to college or work or wherever, starting their families or not starting their families, and what that's going to mean for them. So it's interesting because you don't always know how, what they're going to care about.
Yeah.
I would say, though, the number one thing, and pretty consistently across all of my classes right now, is the environment.
Okay.
Climate change. That's a very big deal to them. And, they'll say, well, I'm going to live 75 more years. I'm worried. And I thought, that's when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
We're not doing that.
That's correct.
We're not living
No,
75 more years. But when they think about it. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. But they are very tolerant of each other and each other's views. And I have a rule that, we don't attack people. We can attack ideas.
Sure.
And they also know that I have an expectation that they know what they believe.
Yeah.
And that's tough because they're at the age where they're kind of starting to shape that and think about what they believe.
Yeah.
And I tell them my job is not to tell you what to believe. It's to tell you how to find good information, how to discern fact from fiction, credible news sources, things like that.
So I do want to come back to that. But before we get to that part of it, I've had conversations, this was probably a year ago now, where I've had conversations with some Sacre students, and we talked about racism. And I was just really impressed with the way that they had that conversation with their peers. Are there any other, and as we know, we did a podcast on racial injustice with Dr. Jones and equity, but are there any other topics, and maybe that's one of them, that are really challenging as a teacher to navigate, and maybe our students even do it better than what we do at times?
Well, when you get into those, especially when you teach government, when kids are talking about what they believe, and they're bringing different experience experiences to the table, and so they may believe what they believe because of a very tangible moment in their lives,
Yeah.
or they may believe it because it's what their parents believe. So it can get a little sticky, and so that's why my rules are, you just need to know why, you need to be able to defend it, and that just
Yeah.
forces them to think about it. Hey, before I say this, can I articulate why? And then we just kind of take chances. We talk about it being a safe space, that
Yeah.
we've got to allow each other to screw up. We've got to allow each other to say the wrong thing. And then
Yeah.
we back up. We say, okay, I didn't say that the way I meant to. But I really, the climate is very sensitive right now. And I think that it's warranted, and I think that that's fine. But I also think when you're talking about kids, they're learning how to be adults. And so they can be told, well, this is, racist, or this sounds intolerant. And they're still, even if their intentions are good, sometimes they screw up. They just say it the wrong way, or
Yeah.
they say it unintentionally. So we work really hard, I think, in several of our humanities classes, and I think in the English department as well, working on that language. And I see it with racism issues. I also see it with gender issues. We have several students who are transgendered, or are in the process, or and everybody's kind of in a different place. I had students who embraced the entire process and were very open and talked about it, and people were informed about it, and then other kids who go through it in a more private way. And so for the other kids to know how to talk about that, but really in social studies, in government, in history, in the history course that I teach, we talk a lot. This is about humanity. I mean, I tell my European history kids that history teaches you how to be a human. And you're going to say dumb things sometimes because we're humans and we're flawed, but we got to work really hard to not be that way, to be tolerant and be inclusive. And you can believe what you want to believe. We talk about that a lot too in government, and regular and AP, that your beliefs are your own and nobody can tell you what to believe. And the government is never going to legislate what you believe. But you have to be prepared to have that there's an opposing belief. And you have to be prepared, sometimes kids will say, oh, well, I believe that, and they told me not to, and I said, well, it's free speech. I said, well, free speech is about the government regulating what you believe.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
about you getting pushback for something that you say. So I try to give them those experiences, so then when they go into the world as adults, then they're a little bit more familiar with,
Yeah.
I have to own what I say, I have to own my behavior,
Yeah.
I have to
Yeah,
be...
the stakes are a little higher. I mean, once you move into
Right. I mean,
adulthood.
I'd rather it be where there's a little bit of a softer landing. I mean,
Sure.
I'm going to tell them, hey, that was not okay, that was inappropriate, but here's
Yeah.
why, and because I really don't believe, I think in my 28 years, this is year 28 of doing this, I've had very, very few kids who have said something like that unkind, that it was malice, that I just haven't had it.
Yeah.
And I think Ames, I'm not saying that Ames is without that, but I think I've had colleagues nationally who talk about these kind of problems in a much more overt way. And but we have to be sensitive overtly and institutionally.
Yeah.
And if we want them to be high functioning, effective, productive, comfortable in their own skin adults, they need to be able to explore that. So we try to create a space where you can maybe say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. But we also have to keep in mind, the other kids in the room.
Right.
That if, who are you offending by saying what you're saying? And, you're learning, but they're also receiving your message. And so
Yeah.
we have to work through that. And generally, they don't require a lot of me. I kind of lay out my ground rules.
Yeah.
And I think they like to, I really do believe that if you set the bar, they're going to try to meet it and exceed it.
Yeah.
They really are. So just don't set it low.
Well, I really appreciate the process of understanding a topic, because oftentimes, there's talking points on both sides, but oftentimes topics are not that simple.
There's nuance. Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance to it, and I just going through that process of not only having a perspective or a viewpoint or an opinion, but the process of getting to that and possibly even changing that over time. I just think it's a hugely valuable skill to have, even moving into adulthood.
Well, if we're going to live in a place that values pluralism, that's one thing.
Yeah.
The Young Democrats and Young Americans for Freedom, they hope to resume it maybe next semester if we're able to be live again. But right now they're not. But they before would meet as often as they could, maybe once a month as a joint group, and they would pick out their topic ahead of time, and they would debate it. And
I just love that.
And they, when the first time we did it, they ran some topics by me, and some of them were pretty, I thought that's really brave. So, well, why don't we start a little slower and let's get to know each other and create a feeling of confidence and security and respect, and then we can dive in. And they absolutely, and then they, did it the next time. So they really do want to be respectful, and they even go so far of, I don't know if we want to say compliment, but hey, thank you for telling me that. I still disagree policy-wise, but I understand so much better why you believe what you believe, and they just do a marvelous job. And I want to just bring in the adults.
Yeah. Well, that type of enthusiasm is not something we're going to see on a debate night, leading into any election, not just this election. It's just I really appreciate that perspective. Information evolves, and how informed, I want to talk about being an informed voter, and honestly how complicated that is, not only for adults leading into this election, but for students as well. I mean, you and I didn't walk around, and I'm going to hold up my phone, with a supercomputer in our pocket where we can get any information we want at the tips of our fingers, and then just navigating the social media component of it. I mean, it's not difficult to create misinformation, and this is on both sides. And so as a teacher, how do you help navigate, our students with that? They have so much information available to them.
Well, there's some research being done right now that's still pretty fluid about, are we more informed now than we were because of the internet? Because we have the capacity to be, but what's out there.
Yeah.
And, for a couple of reasons. Number one is that we have so many choices that we can park ourselves where we want to be, and get that confirmation, affirmation. And another is we can choose to not watch news at all. I mean, when I was a kid, if something bad happened, we all watched one of the 4 channels on TV. And we all watched it, and we all experienced it together. And here, you can turn off the news and turn on one of 20 sports channels or DIY home.
Anything.
There's so many choices.
Turn on Netflix.
Exactly. So that's one thing that's being looked at that's interesting. There's so many choices. But what we do actually, Ms. Stearns and I both, in regular government and AEP government, are pretty similar, is we do a unit on media and fake news.
Okay.
And we talk about how to discern fact from fiction and what is biased news versus fake. And we show them lots of different examples. In fact, I have students who are working, it's due today, on an assignment that is, I showed them some examples of fake, and then I use a resource that shows, it's a media bias chart, and they can see kind of where they fall, and it's updated pretty regularly.
Yeah.
And then they have to find an example, and then why they thought it was fake or why they thought it was biased. So I think really the best thing is just to teach them that discernment skill.
Yeah.
And, that there are, for example, the New York Times is not fake. The New York Times is the paper of record.
Yep.
It is credible. It's internationally recognized. It may not be your, choice of news.
Sure.
But it's absolutely, it's credible.
Yep.
And so we have to talk about that, and that can get a little sticky, because the president dismisses it as fake.
Sure.
And that can get tough, too, because they are, of the mind, well, if the president says it, it must be true. And so that can get a little sticky. So I try to give them some basics there, but really just help them kind of discover, show them some examples, here's the story, and then here's one take on it, and here's another take on it, and we look at bias by omission. I just used with my students the example of a few years ago when a few Ames High School students chose to step aside during the national anthem at a football game.
Yep.
and a blogger.
I remember it well.
A blogger, I imagine you do. A blogger picked it up and he linked it to a news source, and there was all this pushback, and so we used that because the language is very incendiary, and he had, looking at his blog, he had pulled a couple of sentences from the Des Moines Register,
Right.
but it was all very out of context,
Yeah.
and like he referred to them as budding anarchists, which they thought was hilarious.
No, well.
So, I mean, it was so
Yeah.
completely far-fetched and
Yeah.
silly and not even remotely what happened.
Yeah.
But we talked about it, how, did students step off the field and not participate? Yes, they did.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yep.
But the way this makes it sound like is
Yeah.
that it was just this like mutiny. And then there were some falsehoods in it as well. And so we talk about that, and they're like, well, that's here. That's Ames High.
Yeah.
And they like that. So I think, honestly, the best way for them is just to teach them, show them different examples. So when they are looking, one of the first questions I ask is, where do you get your news? And they'll say Twitter.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, a lot of people do, but I
Yep.
but Twitter is not your news source.
Right.
Are you following a news source on Twitter?
Yeah.
Are you seeing what your friends post? If that's all the only news you're getting, then you're depending on your friends to post credible news.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I hadn't really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So it's not that that's bad. You just need to be aware.
Yeah. Right.
And even if you read a biased news source or watch it's not bad. You just need to have an awareness so you
Yeah.
know what you're getting could be leaning. We talk about the same thing when we look at polling.
Yep.
Political polls. Who made the poll? How was the poll worded? You've got to be discerning about your source. So I think that's probably the biggest thing I
Yeah.
do. I don't necessarily say, except for the obvious, this is right, this is
Yeah.
fake.
No, right.
But otherwise, I let them discern. They figure out what they, I said, just because it tells you something that you like doesn't necessarily make it true, and that's
Yeah.
on both sides.
Well, and that's interesting. Just referring back to the, and we have just a couple minutes left, but referring back to the example that you gave, I was at the football game. I read the exact article that, or blog post that you're referring to, but the amount of people who took that blog post as fact and reality was quite shocking to me, to be quite honest with you. I mean, we ended up as a district, we got... it was hate mail from 48, I think, out of 50 states,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it was just fascinating to me just how information very quickly can become reality without, I think, what, you're trying to teach students is having that awareness and being able to discern information.
Yeah.
So
What he wrote was entertainment. I mean, I didn't find it entertaining.
no, I didn't either,
But
quite
it's
honestly.
ridiculous. But he was not. He was trying to get clicks. He's trying
Oh,
to
yeah,
get traffic.
100%.
And they understand that. And
Yeah.
that's something that's interesting is that I don't really have to teach them that. They understand clickbait and they understand
Yeah.
getting lured in. But they were astonished because these students were, I think, freshmen when it
Mm-hmm.
happened. So they kind of remember it happening.
Okay.
But something else that was really remarkable about when it happened is one of the drum majors of the band was in my class when it happened, and we talked about it. And he shared that the band was very respectful and understanding that the students wanted to do it. And they
Yep.
appreciated that they stood off because it was a performance, but completely understood and supported their right to do what they wanted
Yeah.
to do. It was very inclusive and very respectful.
That's exactly right.
And yet this pushback. And some of the students this year said, well, why didn't, people who were happy about it call? And why didn't, because I had told them how they had received so many phone calls. I said, I don't think they thought they needed to.
Yeah.
It's just the way we do it. This is America.
Yeah.
And we have free speech. And these students they didn't, as Tinker versus Des Moines taught us, they don't leave their rights outside
Yeah.
the schoolhouse
Correct.
doors. So people didn't call with support because they didn't know they needed to. So it is interesting, but if they are the future,
Yeah.
then I feel good.
Well, with that said, every podcast goes very fast. I think I say it at the end of every episode. So I wanted to thank you for coming on this episode. It's just incredibly timely leading into this election. So I want to thank you again. And for everyone who's listening, I hope that you enjoyed what you heard, or if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed this podcast. So please share it with others. We appreciate spreading the word about the Amazing Education Podcast. And with that said, we'll be back for another episode shortly. So thank you, Kirstin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.